You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of Indications, a podcast series by the Conference Board. Indications are conversations that take an objective, fact-based look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board and host of this podcast. Today's conversation will focus on the Ukraine-Russian war, the nuclear threat. Our guest today is Hamish de Bretton Gordon, one of the world's leading experts on nuclear, biological and chemical warfare. Hamish has recently published a book called Chemical Warrior. For 30 years, Hamish has served and volunteered in conflict zones around the world. As the British Army's foremost chemical weapons expert, he built a unique first-hand understanding of how to prevent attacks and trained doctors on the front line, saving countless lives in the process. Despite facing extraordinary personal danger, Hamish has unearthed evidence of multiple chemical attacks in Syria and continues to advise the British government at the highest level, including after the 2018 Novichok poisoning in Salisbury. Lifting the lid on Hamish's unique world of battlefield expertise and humanitarian work, Chemical Warrior is a thrilling story of bravery and compassion. Today, Hamish is going to share his thoughts on the nuclear threat posed by Russia on Ukraine. Welcome, Hamish.
Thank you very much.
So given your background relevant to this issue, can you share a little bit about what you've been doing in the past few days to share your expertise?
Well, a variety of things. Obviously, quite a few podcasts like this to try and unravel the complexities of what we're seeing in Ukraine, particularly around the nuclear and the chemical and the biological issue. An awful lot of media. It's probably a good thing that there are not very many people in the world with my type and level of experience. So I'm doing a lot of the media work to try and unravel that so that the people, in the United Kingdom and the USA and elsewhere have a good understanding of what's going on and can make their own decisions. Also, I have a role with the British government. So I'm helping with advice to various elements of the British government. And I also have a role with the British Ministry of Defence. So we are looking at a number of issues in my particular area.
Can you talk a bit about what Russia is trying to accomplish? What are their limitations for themselves? We've heard a little bit about the Russian military doctrine or the use of nuclear, biological and chemical weapons. Why is it so different from the doctrines of NATO military forces?
Well, first of all, NATO doctrine doesn't cover the use of chemical, biological or radiological weapons per se. And that is a key distinction. What Russia is trying to achieve is a rapid victory in Ukraine. And clearly they're not doing that. Hitherto, they've been fighting conventionally and not doing very well. They slightly underestimated the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian civilian population and their ability to fight the Russian invasion force. And it would appear that the Russians are not very well prepared. They have a lot of conscripts whose morale seems to be pretty low. The US and the UK and others have provided a lot of weaponry to the Ukrainian military, predominantly anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons, and these seem to be having a decisive effect. So at the moment, the Russians appear to be bogged down. What they did in Syria and what they learned from Syria is the use of sort of irregular weaponry to be successful. And I think that is now a concern. They have used a lot of white phosphorus, which is an incendiary weapon, to set fire to towns and villages in Syria, which has proved effective. And once fighting gets into the cities like Kiev and other major towns, fighting gets very, very difficult. And this is in the Russian psyche. The Stalingrad battle in the Second World War, over 1 million Red Army soldiers died and many, many hundreds of thousands of civilians. And the Russians understand that. But what they also saw in Syria is that when President Assad, the president of Syria used chemical weapons. They were very successful. In fact, the 4-year siege of Aleppo was broken by the use of chemical weapons. The 5-year siege of Ghouta and the 6-year siege of Douma, both of the last two are suburbs of Damascus. So that is now a concern. The doctrine themselves on how they use chemical weapons is, I think, a little bit out of date. The actual Russian doctrine we know about, and I expect it's been changed. Very recently, in fact, last night, coming out of the White House, there were concerns that American intelligence, supported by British intelligence, had potentially picked up something about biological and chemical weapon use and around what we call a false flag operation. A false flag operation is when an enemy creates a false operation for the pretext to be able to react. And the Russians in recent days have claimed that both the US and the UK are planning to use biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine, which of course is completely untrue. But what we saw in Syria, when they do that sort of thing, they use those weapons themselves.
So we've all read in the media about battlefield and strategic nuclear weapons. What's the difference between the two?
Well, it's almost semantics, to be perfectly straightforward. It's the size of the nuclear weapon. So a strategic nuclear weapon are the intercontinental ballistic missiles with many megatons, that hundreds of thousands of tons worth of equivalent conventional explosive, which will take whole cities out in one go. The battlefield nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons are very much smaller. They're still huge explosions. I think the smallest battlefield nuclear weapon that the Russians have is about 3 kilotons, which is 3,000 tons of TNT or conventional explosive. So absolutely huge. So that is the difference. But once a nuclear weapon is used, in effect, we're then in a nuclear conflict. And that is where things can get really difficult and frightening.
So are we underestimating the risk of chemical weapon attacks in Ukraine? Are they simply threats to psychologically intimidate the West, or what do you think would be the trigger?
Well, I don't think we're underestimating them. I think chemical weapons are horrendous because they're completely indiscriminate and they tend to affect civilians more than soldiers. Soldiers usually have gas masks, which is the main protection against chemical weapons. And as I mentioned earlier, they've been so effective in Syria, which has been done on President Putin's watch, that if they get bogged down in the cities, they are very likely, in my opinion, to use chemical weapons. And the people who really suffer will be the civilians. The nuclear dimension, I think, is slightly different. President Putin has already threatened the international community with nuclear weapons. And I think he's doing that to terrify us so that we go to our politicians and presidents and prime ministers to capitulate and acquiesce and let the Russians get on with it. He's threatening using nuclear weapons in Ukraine to terrify the civilian population, because it's the civilian population he wants to surrender so he can take over Ukraine and mold it into, part of a greater Russia, as he's already done in Syria. So I don't think we're underestimating the potential use of chemical weapons. And it's absolutely crucial that our governments are very firm. Some will remember the massive chemical attack in Syria in August 2013, when President Assad dropped the deadly nerve agent sarin on suburbs of Damascus, killing over 1,500 people. President Obama had drawn a red line on the use of chemical weapons, but sadly, the British government voted not to punish Assad for it, and the American government followed suit. That really was a message to every dictator, despot, rogue state, and terror group that you could use chemical weapons without punishment. And I think that's why we're in this position now. And we need to be absolutely firm and on the balls of our feet. Because at the moment, Putin's calling all of the shots, but he is failing. He is losing in Ukraine, and we need to push home our advantage. But we also need to negotiate with him so we get some sort of reasonable peace for everybody.
Can you say something a bit more about Russia's arsenal of chemical weapons? Like, what's the blast radius of the average bomb? What kind of impact could it have on cities, European Union, the globe?
Well, there are really two parts to it. Well, what is his chemical capability? Well, what's his chemical and biological capability, and what's his nuclear? On the chemical capability, we don't really know. Chemical weapons were supposed to be removed from the globe, as it were. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has done a very good job. In fact, in 2017, the Russians declared they had no chemical weapons. But we then saw a chemical weapons attack in Salisbury, from where I'm talking to you from now. So it is unclear what chemical weapons the Russians have, but we certainly know that they have Novichok, which is a nerve agent, and they certainly have access to unlimitless numbers of weapons like chlorine and ammonia and cyanide. The impact of those depends on how much he uses, but to unprotected civilians, it can be devastating. When it comes to nuclear, the nuclear global policy is mutually assured destruction. The combination of the US and NATO have roughly the same amount of nuclear weapons as Russia does, and both are enough to destroy most of the major cities on the planet. Some of the very large nuclear weapons that Russia possesses are enough to destroy completely several blocks in a city, and the radiation and contamination can cover up to 20 or 30 kilometers diameter around that explosion. So very, very extensive. The smaller ones that they use on the battlefield are much more limited, but are incredibly explosive. So I think the point to take from this is that both the US and NATO and Russia possess an unbelievable arsenal of nuclear weapons, which hopefully will mean that they won't be used. And I think we're a long way from getting into a nuclear battle at the moment. When it comes to chemical weapons, then we are less certain. And I think that is an area that we need to look at, because, again, I think the key thing is how successful chemical weapons have been in Syria, and the international community's done nothing about it. I think Putin probably believes he can use them in Ukraine, and again, the international community will not act.
Which actually leads me on to my next question. As you say, for the past 5 years, Russian forces have been fighting alongside the Assad regime, and it's almost as if that's been a battle lab for Putin to hone his forces' skills and trial equipment. Why is he involving Syrians now, and what other countries do you think he'll attempt to draw in?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The last 5 years has been a battle lab for him in Syria. He's trialed new weaponry and trialed some pretty devastating tactics that we're seeing. His Syrian playbook, if you like, he's using in Ukraine. That's attacking hospitals, attacking primary schools, burning towns and villages, all war crimes and all horrendous, but again, being very successful. And Syria, I think, was the first part of his plan to expand to a greater Russia, to try and reimpose the old geographical boundaries of the Soviet Union. Where he will go next, that is a key issue. I think because the international community didn't punish him or the Syrian regime for the atrocities in Syria, it sort of gave him a green light to do whatever he wanted. And I think that is a huge, huge concern that we need to bear in mind. Where he goes from here, I mean, that again is a huge challenge. Who knows? One would hope that Ukraine will be the stop, because, of course, at the moment, we are not in conflict with Russia. But if he puts one tank track or one Russian boot to the west of Ukraine, he's on NATO soil. And Article 5 would say that we would then act and we would then be in conflict with Russia.
So we've talked about Russia's military doctrine on the use of chemical and nuclear weapons and why it's different from the NATO military forces. We've talked about the difference between battlefield and strategic nuclear weapons and the risk of an attack in Ukraine. We've also looked at the arsenal of weapons at Russia's disposal and what we can learn from Russia's experience fighting alongside the Assad regime. Next, we'll look into who, if anyone, can influence Russia, Russians' ambitions in all of this, the impact of a nuclear attack, and what companies need to be thinking about. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of my conversation with Hamish.
As war rages in Ukraine, the Conference Board is closely monitoring the situation and producing timely and relevant content on a daily basis that will help the business community navigate this global geopolitical unrest. What will the impact be on oil prices, food prices, our supply chain, and what about cybersecurity? How will this conflict impact the way your organization does business around the world? And how will you communicate this crisis to customers and employees? We're gathering the very latest content on our website. Just head to conference-board.org and find trusted insights to help you and your team lead with confidence.
Welcome back to Indications podcast. I'm your host, Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Hamish de Bretton Gordon. So, Hamish, what would China or NATO need to do to prevent further escalation? Do you have any comments on China's role in all of this? Would they potentially send troops? Would they help? Any weapons? And also, like beyond China, are there any individuals or organizations or countries that could influence Russia?
That's a very good question. I think China is a key player in all of this. And we're all concerned that the Chinese and the Russians have seemed to come together over the last 12 months in some sort of pact. And that is very dangerous. They're both autocratic states and sort of seem to run things without much care or thought for civilian populations. We've seen over the pandemic that the Chinese have not really engaged with the West, the international community, to work out, how the pandemic evolved. And that is an area of concern. And we've also seen some of the human rights issues in China as well, which are not dissimilar to some of the ways that the Russians deal with civilians as well. It would be really helpful if the Chinese came out and called the Russians out. But, they haven't even done that in the United Nations. And I expect the Chinese think, what Russia is doing in Ukraine is not as dreadful as how we see it. Because again, their issue on human rights is pretty dodgy. They could play a huge role. I'm sure if China wanted to, they could tell Putin to stop, and he would do, because Russia is so reliant on Chinese money and Chinese goods that would have a really significant way of trying to bring some sort of peace there. So they've got a lot to play. We've got to be very concerned of not getting into any sort of diplomatic or political engagement with China that could lead to them getting closer to Russia as well, because obviously China is a massive place. It has a massive military as well, and a lot of resources. But one would hope that they would influence the Russians and help them to do it, because apart from China, I don't see that Russia has any other friends in the world. Maybe North Korea and President Assad of Syria, but quite frankly, those two countries are pretty irrelevant in this global conflict, or preventing this global conflict. So I agree. I think China has a key role to play, but I don't think they're going to do it. I think they're going to sit quietly in the background and scoop up as much as they can from the fallout, lest we forget, how well they have done out of the pandemic. We need to be very wary, I think, of China's role here.
And should Russia's ambitions exceed Ukraine, where do you think they'd focus? Where would their next priority be? The Swalaki Gap, Estonia, Moldova, Kazakhstan. Do they ever go as far as Poland, Romania? What's your opinion on his plan here?
Well, it's a challenge to work out what he'll do next. It's very clear that the American and British and other intelligence leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was very good. But actually, most people didn't believe it. Nobody believed that Putin would be so reckless as to invade Ukraine. But he has, and he said it to prevent Ukraine becoming a part of NATO and to prevent NATO encroaching closer to Russia. Of course, at the end of the Cold War, all those countries you mentioned were part of the Soviet bloc and then became independent and then joined NATO. So that buffer that the Russians had between themselves and NATO disappeared. Now, whether he would move forward, I don't think so. I mean, although Putin is making a lot of irrational decisions at the moment, most of those countries you mentioned are now members of NATO. And Article 5 stipulates that an attack on one member of NATO is attack on all. And Putin will know that. Putin also knows that conventionally his forces are no match for NATO. And if he got involved in conventional conflict, he would certainly lose, which is why I think he's been threatening the nuclear option, because that's the only place that he has parity with the US and NATO. One would hope that Ukraine is as far as he will go. Ukraine was not a member of NATO, not a member of the EU, and in theory, just an individual country. And lest we forget, he, of course, invaded Georgia some time ago, and nobody will forget the carnage he created in Chechnya again a few years ago. So one would hope his ambitions don't extend beyond Ukraine, but we can't take that for granted. We've got to get on the front foot and show him that we will resist, we will react, because he thinks we're weak and he thinks that we won't react because we don't want to get involved in a conflict that could create many, many casualties. We must absolutely ensure that he knows that we will act so that he goes no further than Ukraine and sues for peace as soon as possible.
The West needs to stand up now, yes. So how could this impact food production in the region? So if there's a large-scale nuclear conflict, it would blast smoke and soot. We'd have a nuclear winter. Sunlight would be blocked for a very, very long time. So we're right now at a point where we're talking about it's the crop season. We need to make sure that we, plant, because we already think there's going to be a shortage. But if there is a nuclear attack, what kind of crops do you think we'd need to then grow? We also need to be contingency planning as well because of this fear factor.
Well, without wanting to be too downbeat, obviously if there's a large-scale nuclear conflict, food production is going to pretty much draw to a standstill, and we're going to have some real challenges. But I think one needs to be clear that although there will be devastation and destruction, not everywhere will be covered with radiation and contamination. There will be a lot of areas, perhaps more than 50% of, say, Europe and the UK, that is uncontaminated. So you could certainly, depending what those areas are, obviously the mountainous areas, it's going to be difficult to grow cereals and whatever. But the devastation is such that we must do absolutely all we can to prevent a nuclear conflict. And let's not forget, the nuclear weapons of the US and the UK and France and the nuclear weapons of Russia have kept the peace since the Second World War. And we've had some really tricky times like the Bay of Pigs in Cuba and other times where we've come close, but we've always managed to move away from that. So I think it's probably, it's probably not worth getting people worried about what to plant if all the soil's contaminated, because that is the nightmare scenario, as it were, and the sunlight going. I don't think we need to look overly dramatic about that. What we must focus all our efforts on is making absolutely sure that it doesn't develop into a nuclear conflict, and also that we get peace in Ukraine as quickly as possible, because lots of civilians are dying already. And in Syria, over the 10 years of the conflict, 800,000 civilians have died in that conflict. And, it would be absolutely unbelievably dreadful to allow that to happen in Ukraine. So I think all our efforts need to go on avoiding nuclear conflict and getting to a peace as quickly as possible. There might have to be some pretty unpalatable concessions and decisions made with the Russians to ensure that happens, but anything less than nuclear conflict must be our aim.
So several of our member companies, have operations in Ukraine and have been evacuating staff in the past week. What contingency plans do you think they should put in place given the situation now?
Well, it's very, very, very difficult, and I'm sure very unnerving for staff who are operating in Ukraine. And as you say, many people have moved out of there. And those who are remaining, I think it's very important that they're given as much advice as possible of what to do to give, and also provided with, relevant personal protection equipment, to counter the chemical side. Obviously, gas masks and escape hoods and other bits and pieces are important, and also body armor and stuff like that, because there's lots of shrapnel and other things flying around that can cause danger. So all sensible precautions should be taken, and certainly where the fighting is heaviest, and looking at places like Kiev and Mariupol and others, if you don't absolutely need to be there, one would go. Hopefully people will stay as close to Ukraine as possible, because there is an option that we will find a peace in the next few weeks or so, or months. And obviously the important thing is to get Ukraine back up and running as quickly as possible. And if people dissipate too far around the place, that is going to be a challenge. But it's very important that people working in Ukraine absolutely understand the risks and are given the opportunity to move if that's the most sensible thing to do. Key that people keep in very close touch with national governments and also regional support agencies, so that they know what the latest situation is, where the battle's going, etc., etc. And certainly, the US and British governments are issuing advice all the time, and that advice should be followed to the letter.
Final question. We've seen the sanctions that have been imposed. Do you think they can work short term, long term?
Well, to be absolutely frank, it's not really my area of expertise, but I do think Putin's greatest weakness is the Russian people. The Russian people don't know what's going on in Ukraine. They don't know the war crimes that are being committed in their name. And I have great faith in the Russian people. I'm sure 99.9% of them are very decent, moral people. And if they understood what was going on under their name, then they would react and get rid of Putin, because that is really what we need to do.
Thank you for joining us today, Hamish, and providing our listeners with a roundup on the state of the Russia-Ukraine war and the nuclear threat. I think key lesson that we all take away is the West stood back and watched in Syria, and it must not do the same in Ukraine. And thanks to all of you for listening to the Indications podcast. Every few weeks I'll be joined by experts to provide insights on this issue. We'll cover the leading topics in public policy, environmental, supply chain, governance, and the economy. Please share the Indications podcast with your colleagues. You can do that by visiting the conference board /podcasts. I'm Sara Murray, and this podcast has been brought to you by the conference board. Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, your source of trusted insights for what's ahead. For the latest insights to help guide your business through this time of geopolitical unrest, we have daily and relevant updates on our website at conference-board.org.